All right. So good morning. My name is Amanda Pickett. I'm an educational consultant for the Connecticut State Department of Education. I'm also a member of the CAS Equity Committee. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our breakout session, Nurturing Young People's Critical Consciousness to Thrive in and Transform the World. This topic is critically important as we dive more deeply and explore how we can work together to learn and lead for systemic racial and social justice. So thank you so much for attending this session and joining us today. I want to recognize and thank some of our partners, so the State Department of Ed and SERC, for their generous support in helping us make this possible. A couple of quick reminders, if you could please stay muted. If possible, please turn on your video. It's always nice to be able to see everybody. You can ask your questions in the chat, and we're going to do our best to save some time at the end to go through those questions. And if you're having any technical problems, feel free to put that in the chat as well. We're going to be monitoring that as we go along. The webinar is being recorded and is going to be posted to the CAS website. You'll receive notification of that when it becomes available. Feel free to share the session materials and the recordings with your colleagues, friends, students. Our hope is that you find it useful for professional learning within your school community during this coming school year and beyond. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for this session to you. Scott Seider is an associate professor of applied developmental psychology at the Boston College Lynch School of Education and Human Development. His research focuses on the civic development of adolescents, and he has reported on his work in more than 70 academic publications. He's also the author of many books on this topic. Just to give him a little bit more credibility, if that wasn't enough, he was a teacher educator at Boston University and a secondary English teacher in the Boston Public Schools. Welcome, Scott.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for joining this session. It's I've been listening this morning to to all of the teachers and students and administrators and Secretary of Education, and it's been really inspiring, and I'm just thrilled to be part of this day. And so let's jump into it. I'm going to share my screen. And we'll get going. And so just to very briefly, add to Amanda's introduction, I'm currently a faculty member at Boston College, and before that I worked at Boston University, and before that I was a high school English teacher in the Boston Public Schools, and actually even before that in a little town outside Boston called the Westwood Public Schools. And so I've been involved in education for 20 years. I think I'm here today in large part because me and my colleague Darren Graves is also presenting today. Published this book in 2020 called Schooling for Critical Consciousness, which really tries to think about the role that educators and schools can play in preparing young people to analyze, navigate, and challenge racism. And I want to jump into just some of the key practices and findings from the book, but I also do want to say a word or two about what led us, and maybe even me in particular, to get involved in this. And so I suspect that if we were having this summit 10 years ago, if 10 years ago we'd all been sort of called to a summit, we might well have found ourselves talking about issues of character and potentially social emotional learning, because if you think about some of the stuff that was some of the ideas that felt like they were dominating education 10 years ago, there was this real interest in grit and perseverance. And Paul Tough had his book How Children Succeed, and Angela Duckworth had her book on grit. And I'm about to be and far be it for me to be too critical of that, because I was also one of those folks, right? Like you can see, I wrote a book in the 2012 called Character Compass, which reported on different approaches to character development in schools. And I don't want to criticize any of that work, in the sense that I think that all of those qualities like perseverance and grit can be really useful to young people in pushing towards success. But I think what I started to worry about, like in right around 2012, 2013, was that I think that as an educational community, sometimes our enthusiasm over these internal qualities like grit and perseverance and so on and so forth might lead us to actually understate or articulate to students that yes, our internal qualities matter in our sort of striving for success and navigating the world we live in, but there are also external social forces that are impacting our movement through the world. And if we're only talking to children about this idea that effort determines success, and that you control your destiny 100%, and we're not preparing young people to contend with external forces like racism, like sexism, like classism, like ableism, then that feels worrisome to me. right? And I think that concern, which was sort of sitting in the back of my head in 2012, was only exacerbated by the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think as a, particularly as a white person in the United States, deeply sort of raised my recognition of the role that structural forms of racism were playing in our lives and communities. And so I started asking the question, well, what should we as schools and what should we as educators be doing to prepare young people to navigate and challenge external forces like racism? There was right around 2012, 2013, as the Black Lives Matter movement was taking off, you might remember there were lots of newspaper articles and NPR stories about the role that parents played in preparing children of color in particular in learning to navigate and challenge, forces of racism. But me and I was interested in those stories as someone who's becoming a parent for the first time, but I'm also sort of with my education hat, I was starting to think well, what's the role that schools are playing in this work? And what's the role that schools could be playing in this work? And that's what really led me and Darren to begin our Schooling for Critical Consciousness project. And I want to share some of the results of that project with you today. And ultimately, my goal is by the end of the session, for you to have a clear sense of what critical consciousness is and why it matters. And then equally important, to have some opportunities to be introduced to some practices that have worked in other school settings for nurturing young people's critical consciousness. And not because I think that, schools are such context specific places, that it's not that I think that I can show you something that worked in a school in Newark, New Jersey, or in Boston, Massachusetts, or in New York City, and say this is exactly what you should do. But rather my goal is in showing you some of the practices that educators in other spaces have been using to catalyze your own thinking about what does make sense in your context, in your classroom, in your school. And so let's jump into it. And so that term critical consciousness, which was the term that I really came across as I was seeking an answer to the question, what role can schools and educators play in preparing young people to navigate and challenge oppressive forces like racism? That term critical consciousness comes from a Brazilian philosopher named Paulo Freire, who defined critical consciousness as the ability to recognize oppressive social forces and take action against them. And so there's both a reflection component, an analysis component, and an action component to Freire's definition, right? And Freire sort of developed this idea of critical consciousness as an educator himself. He was a literacy teacher in Brazil working with adult migrant laborers. He discovered that the adults he was working with were motivated to learn to read, were motivated to deepen their literacy skills because they wanted to better understand their social conditions. They were living under an authoritarian government and wanted to develop literacy skills in order to better understand the forces with which they were contending. And Freire came to believe that critical consciousness, the term he used to describe that ability to decode your social conditions and to act against those oppressive forces, he came to believe that should be the purpose of education. And so just to try to make that a little bit more concrete, here's a quote from a ninth grader that was part of our study, and who I think is demonstrating critical consciousness. And this is a ninth grader. She was 13 years old when we interviewed her. And she said, and we asked her a question about, what do you think racism is? And she said, racism is something that's kind of imprinted in the history of this country. White people have had more opportunities throughout history. And then when the Japanese people came over, they were pushed to the side. Different groups and ethnicities and races don't all have equal opportunities. And it's just kind of in people's minds, and it's really hard to get out. And so by my way of thinking, this would be an example of a young person demonstrating some critical consciousness about what racism is and how it works. And so Freire believed that critical consciousness should be a primary goal of education. And if you asked him why, he would have said, because we need people to be critically conscious in order to transform society. Freire sort of as a philosopher, felt like critical consciousness was an important tool for challenging oppression and transforming the societies in which we live. And I would say that still remains a primary goal of critical consciousness. Interestingly, over the last few years, a number of psychologists have also found that critical consciousness is also a predictor of individual thriving, particularly for young people from marginalized groups, whether that's racially marginalized groups, marginalized by gender, by sexual orientation, linguistically. And so what these psychologists have found, and you can see I've reported some of this research here, is that young people who are critically conscious are more resilient, they have higher self-esteem, they're more politically engaged, they have higher professional aspirations, higher academic engagement. In my own work with my colleague Darren Graves, like we actually found that the high school students we were studying, that the high school students who showed the greatest gains in critical consciousness over their 4 years of high school finished high school with, on average, the highest cumulative grade point averages. And so some of our work has sort of demonstrated a link between critical consciousness and academic achievement. And as for why that might be, I actually think it goes back to the point I was making at the very beginning about recognizing the way in which external social forces impact our lives. Because if you're a young person of color, for instance, and you're sort of making your way through the world, if you're encountering obstacles posed by racism, right? If you're not particularly critically conscious, you're very likely, if you don't sort of recognize the ways in which racism shapes our lives and communities, then you're very likely to, as you come across those obstacles, you're much more likely to blame yourself or your family or your identity group for this obstacle that you're coming across. Whereas if you're more critically conscious about the way in which race and racism work in our society, then as you come across that obstacle or that challenge or that barrier, you sort of recognize, like, this isn't about me. Like, this is an external social force that has been placed in my pathway. And that doesn't mean that that doesn't sort of immediately eradicate that obstacle or that barrier. But once you recognize that barrier is external, then you can start to make plans and strategies for navigating that barrier or challenging that barrier. And so that's sort of one of the ways in which scholars think that's one of the reasons scholars think that critical consciousness is predictive of all these positive outcomes for young people. Let me keep going. Okay, and so in terms of thinking about critical consciousness, Freire's original definition was sort of focused on analysis and action. Like you have to be able to sort of recognize an oppressive force in our society like racism and be motivated to act against it, act to challenge it. In recent years, some scholars have added a third piece to that definition, political agency, which they sort of describe as the bridge between analysis and action. And political agency is your belief that you can impact, that you can navigate and challenge an oppressive force like racism or sexism or ableism. And these scholars would sort of argue that you need to sort of be able to engage in analysis to recognize how racism or sexism are working in our society, but you're not going to be moved to action unless you have a feelings of agency, unless you believe that I can take action in ways that will challenge these social forces or allow me to navigate these social forces. And so I think this three-part definition, where you sort of think about social analysis, a political agency as a bridge to social action, is a really useful way of thinking about what are the skills and sort of mindsets that we need to foster in young people in order for them to become critically conscious and to be able to navigate and challenge oppressive social forces in our society. And let me just say a word or two about each of these and give examples of each of these. And so social analysis, like I'm talking about just the ability to name, recognize, and analyze oppressive forces like racism. And so in one of the schools that we were studying, the young people were reading Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. There were 10th graders reading The Bluest Eye. And the teacher did a really nice job of using Morrison's book to talk about dominant standards of beauty in the United States, right? Like the ways in which, as a society, we privilege white skin, we privilege blonde hair, we privilege blue eyes, like in terms of our definitions of what is beautiful. And that sort of gave the students an opportunity to engage in social analysis of how, of oppression really at the intersection of racism and sexism, right? And I think that was a really powerful social analysis opportunity for some of the young people we were studying. In terms of social action, this is kind of an amazing example, frankly, that happened in another school that we were studying, which was that in another school that we were studying, the French embassy in the United States issued a travel warning to French tourists saying, if you go to the city in which the school is located, don't go to the neighborhood that the school is located in because it's too dangerous. And the young people in this school, their French teacher brought this to their attention. They were offended by this characterization of their community, and so they ended up writing a letter to the French consul general in their city, protesting this travel advisory and asking it to be reconsidered, and in fact inviting the consul general to come to their school, take a tour of their community, and engage in dialogue about this what they felt like was an unfair characterization of their community. And you can actually see in this picture the young people in this French class delivering their letter to the French consul general's office. And in fact, their efforts did lead the consul general to visit the school, visit the community, and engage in real dialogue about what was happening. And then lastly, I'll just say political agency. As I said, the bridge between analysis and action is the belief that one has the capacity to affect change. And this is just, in a third school that we were studying, the student government in that school really did have some power and influence within sort of the school's policy-making body, right? And so I think that, those of us in schools know that, like, there are some schools that have student governments that pretty much kind of like plan social events, and that's sort of their full, their full set of responsibilities. And other schools have student governments where the young people really have a voice in the running of the school. And this was one of those schools. And so this is actually a picture from the bulletin board in the school where the student government was reporting out to their peers, this is what we're working on. And one of the things that the student government was working on was that the school had a dress code policy that the students perceived to be sexist, that it was treating young women in the school different, like more stringently than it was treating young men, and the student government was working to change that. And one of the things that we found as part of our study was that those kinds of in-school opportunities to affect change had a dramatic effect on young people's feelings of political agency, their belief that they could affect change in a variety of types of communities. And so those are some definitions of that's hopefully gives you sort of a sense of what we mean when we say critical consciousness and the different components of critical consciousness. And then what our study involved was going into 5 different high schools across the northeastern United States, in 5 different cities, and that all were sort of seeking to nurture young people's critical consciousness in different ways. And our goal was to sort of understand different approaches and practices that can be successful in doing this kind of work. And my goal today, as I said, is to share with you a couple of those practices, not because I think those individual practices will fit exactly in your school context, but because I hope they can catalyze your own thinking about what is possible and what is feasible and what is sensible in your school context. And so let me share with you a couple of those practices, and also try to give you some time to talk in smaller groups about what gets sparked in your own thinking. So let me try to give an example of social analysis, and then I'll give sort of an example of social action. So one of the schools in our study is a school that we call Make the Road Academy. It's a pseudonym. And this was a school that actually had explicitly named itself after Paulo Freire. This was a mural of Paulo Freire in the school's lobby. And the school was actively trying to sort of utilize some of Freire's suggestions for fostering critical consciousness that he had written about in his publications. And one of the things that we found, and I should say this was a 4-year study. We followed the young people in the class of 2017 from the first day of high school to their graduations 4 years later. And that allowed us to collect a ton of data about how young people's critical consciousness was changing over time. And the only thing I'll say about this graph is that when we looked at the young people graduating from Make the Road Academy, in comparison to the other 4 schools that we were studying, we found that the young people at Make the Road Academy were graduating with a deeper understanding of systemic forms of racism than their peers in all the other schools that we were studying. Like, there was something different about these young people in the way they were graduating from high school. They were demonstrating significantly higher awareness and understandings of how systemic racism worked. And so me and Darren asked ourselves, well, what's going on with that? Like, what's contributing to that deeper understanding of systemic racism? And there were a couple things that were happening. One of the things that we found to be really powerful and that we think has implications for educators everywhere is that in the 9th grade at Make the Road Academy, all of the young people took a class called social engagement class. It was similar to a history class, but in the social engagement class that all the 9th graders took, they were introduced to a framework for making sense of oppression. The young people learned that oppression could be interpersonal in nature, institutional in nature, or internalized in nature. And the school referred to this framework as the 3 I's framework. And the students engaged in a whole bunch of activities to help them sort of make sense of this framework and think about the ways in which these different forms of oppression play out in the world. And so for example, the students were assigned to draw a picture of a community sort of besieged by the 3 I's. And you can see one young person's picture of a community where interpersonal, institutional, and internalized forms of oppression are sort of pulling down that community. And then sort of the next day, the young people read the Black Panther Party's 10-point platform for self-defense, which was a document that the Black Panther Party had produced in the early 1970s, saying these are the conditions that we as Black people need in order to survive and thrive in the United States. And after reading that document and thinking about like the conditions that the Black Panther Party was calling for, the young people actually drew their picture again, sort of imagining that those 10 points had been sort of incorporated into this community. And they sort of engaged in dialogue and discussion about like, how could these 10 points advocated for by the Black Panther Party, challenge the different forms of oppression that they had drawn in their pictures. And so that just gives you a sense of the ways in which, like in this school, the young people were sort of learning as ninth graders about how to think about oppression. And what was really powerful, we found, was that even years later, when we interviewed young people at this school about how they thought about oppressive forces like racism and classism, they kept returning to that 3 I's framework they had learned as ninth graders. And so, for example, we were interviewing this young man, Michael, as a 12th grader. So, 3 years after he took the social engagement class. And we were asking him a little bit about how oppression works. And he explained, he said, well, like in our city, it's a lot of chicken shacks everywhere. You can always find a chicken shack here. But if you go out to like the suburbs or something like that, you're not going to find nowhere around. You're not going to find one nowhere around. You might find a Whole Foods or like a farmer's market or something like that. The options of everything is just much different. And it just seems like certain things are put where they're put for a reason. And I think what you can see there is like, is an 18-year-old who's describing like institutional forms of oppression and specifically food deserts in a very sophisticated way, right? Like, and when we said to him, like, Michael, like, how do you pick up on that, right? Like he said, well, freshman year, when we were in the social engagement class, it made me think about stuff differently. And once I started thinking about it, you start putting the pieces together and you start noticing like nothing happens just because, like it's all for some reason, like somebody's benefiting from everything, somebody's not benefiting from everything. It's set up this way for a certain reason. And what I think like Michael points to in this, is the power of introducing young people to a framework for making sense of the world. Like, and, I was a high school teacher. I actually teach adolescent psychology here at Boston College. And I can tell you that one of the things we say is the central task of adolescence is to seek out new and different ways of understanding the world. And I think that's one of the reasons that parents sometimes find teenagers so challenging, because teenagers are actively seeking to go beyond what they've learned from their parents and seek out new and different ways of understanding the world. And so a framework like the 3 I's framework is exactly, is giving young people a new tool for making sense of the world they're living in, which is exactly what young people are looking for. And you can see a student like Michael really taking that tool and using it to try to make sense of his community and surrounding communities. And what was super powerful about what was going on at Make the Road Academy is because that school had introduced all of its ninth graders to that framework in the ninth grade, what that meant was that other teachers in 10th grade, 11th grade, and 12th grade could call on that framework to help students recognize the workings of oppression within their own academic subjects. And so I mentioned that 10th grade class that was studying Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, like that teacher who wanted students to think about dominant standards of beauty in the United States could use the language of internalized forms of oppression to engage in that topic, because that was terminology and part of a framework that the students had already been introduced to. And you can see some of the student work that came out of that study of dominant standards of beauty and the way that it could impact internalized forms of oppression. So that was one school that we were studying that we saw using a framework in a particularly powerful way. And we actually saw a similar thing happen at another school, Espiritu High School. And I'll just very briefly say that like in an 11th grade American history class, we watched a teacher sort of say to her students at the start of a unit on the civil rights movement, she said, hey, there are more books written about Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks than all of the other figures in the civil rights movement combined. And she said, like, why is that? Like, why is it that so much has been written about these two people and, in comparison to everybody else? And the students sort of started speculating about why that might be. And then the teacher offered the students a framework for considering an answer to that question. And this is a framework called the Storytelling for Social Justice framework that comes from a scholar named Leanne Bell at Barnard College in New York City. And what Bell argues is that the way we talk about race and racism in this country, we have stock stories, which are stories meant to preserve the status quo, but that underneath those stock stories, we have resistance stories, which are stories that offer sort of a deeper understanding of how race and racism are working, but that are concealed by stock stories. And the teacher sort of hypothesized to her students that if you make Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks like the stock story of the civil rights movement, then what you're sort of saying is that these two extraordinary human beings, are what led to societal change. And she said, like, the resistance story, underneath that stock story is that there were many, there were thousands of activists, working hard that made the work of Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks possible. And I can actively remember as a young child being told that Rosa Parks like refused to move to the back of the bus because she was tired, right? Like that was the stock story that I remember being taught about Rosa Parks, when in fact, like Rosa Parks was an activist who had engaged, this was a strategic decision on her part, like to refuse to move to the back of the bus, like in Alabama, so as to sort of kick off this bus boycott that ultimately led to greater civil rights legislation. And so like that explicit activism on the part of Rosa Parks is the resistance story, or I should say it's the concealed story hidden underneath the stock story. And then in that class, I watched as the young people started sort of applying this framework to other stories they had been told, right? And they thought about, oh, like there's a stock story about about Thanksgiving that we have been told, but there's a concealed story about Thanksgiving as well. There's a stock story about the American dream. There's a concealed story as well. And this was again a situation where we found it to be very powerful, like this introduction of a framework seemed to be quite powerful, like for helping young people engage in social analysis of how oppression works. And let me just give one more example, and I think it's always important for me to offer an elementary example and also sort of a math science example, because I think sometimes it can be harder for folks in the math and sciences to kind of picture their role in this work. And so this is actually not something from our project, but from our colleague Carrie Coca, who's a terrific professor at the University of Math Education at the University of Pittsburgh. And this is an example of a problem, a word problem that Carrie took from an elementary math teacher in the Pittsburgh public schools. And the math teacher had been assigned to teach his students about the number line. And the district problem for teaching about the number line involved using this hot air balloon word problem, like where Scott's in a hot air balloon and it travels like 5 miles north, and then it goes back 2 miles south, and then and where are you on the number line? And the math teacher said to himself, like, I think that there's a way I can do this. I can get at that same skill, but just a little bit differently. And so he made up a similar word problem that starts, Kalia wants to make a gumbo for her grandmother, but there are no grocery stores in her neighborhood. So she has to take the bus to several stores to get the ingredients she needs. And if you look at part B, it is exactly the same mathematical question as the hot air balloon problem. Kalia gets on the bus and she goes 17 blocks north to the grocery mart to get the shrimp. And then she gets back on the bus and takes it 29 blocks south towards her house to get the okra. And she takes it north 7 more blocks to get the crab meat. Like it's the same mathematical question. But what I think is really interesting is that part A, the math teacher asks, well, what do you think about Kalia's access to food? And do you think that's fair? What issues might this cause Kalia and her family or other people of her community? And so what you have here, right, is a teacher who with his 5th graders is getting at the exact same issue of food deserts as as Michael was referencing in his city, when he was talking about chicken shacks versus Whole Foods, like in his community versus the suburban communities outside his community. And what I think is particularly interesting about this problem is that the math teacher is accomplishing 2 things at once here, right? Like he is deepening his students' engagement in the mathematics itself, like by offering an example that's much more sort of relevant, to their lives and to their community, and using sort of examples of stores from their community. And he's simultaneously creating space to engage in social analysis, right? Like, what do you think about the fact that nutritious resources are not available, within a 2-block radius of Kalia's house? And I think that like that's a really important example because it's pointing to the ways in which like this critical consciousness work I do not mean it to be something that's like added on to the work that we're already doing as educators, but in fact, something that like enhances the work that we're doing as educators, right? Like, and that's the reason I would suspect that young people who are more critically conscious are also higher academically achieving and more resilient and more politically engaged and actually have higher professional aspirations and so on and so forth, because they are feeling a deeper sense of meaning and engagement in the work that they're doing in school. And then very last but not least, I'll just give one science example, an elementary science example. And this comes from a really terrific academic named Natalie Davis, who's now at Georgia State University. But she was looking at an elementary school in Michigan where the young people were about to study water systems in their science class. But the teacher kicked off that study of water systems by asking young people to think about the Flint water crisis, right? Like, and you can see in the middle picture that that a child has written sort of facts and opinions about the Flint water crisis. And you can see facts, they have old pipes. Facts, the government knew that lead was in the water. Opinion, I am mad at the government. And so I think you can see an example there of like very young children engaging in a science context in social analysis of an issue like deeply relevant to, you know, to their own lives and communities. Okay, so I've talked, you know, for a little while, and I want to give you a chance to act, you know, to think about some of these things. And so I'm just gonna, just for 5 minutes, I'm just gonna ask you to meet with to randomly, I'm gonna randomly pair you with a couple colleagues, and would you just say a little bit about what ideas got sparked for you by these social analysis practices? It could be connections to something you're already doing. It could be something that like you would like to do. And then maybe if you have time, what questions do you have about engaging students in this type of social analysis? So what ideas got sparked for you, and what questions do you have about engaging students in this type of work? And so I'm going to stop sharing. I am going to put those questions in the chat so you have them. And truly just 5 minutes. So just a chance just to chat with colleagues for just a moment about what these examples get you thinking about. Okay, I think we are all back, and I from a year and a half of teaching the pandemic, I now know that no one coming back until they're absolutely forced back is a good sign. And so I'm gonna actually make sure to try to get you back into those groups, same groups, one more time in just a few minutes. But let me continue on. Give you a couple more examples. Share screen. Okay, so having talked a little bit about social analysis, let me try to give you some examples of some of the schools that we studied that were engaging in powerful ways in social action and political agency, kind of the action dimensions of critical consciousness. And so another of the schools that we were studying is a school that we call Leadership High School, which was a school that was explicitly sort of interested in engaging young people in different types of action civics work. And you can see a bulletin board in the school that explicitly was sort of saying to students like, hey, here's different ways that you can be civically engaged and civically involved. And one of the things we found when we looked at our survey data from 4 years of collecting data from the young people in the class of 2017, from the first day of freshman year to the last day of graduation, was that the young people at Leadership High School were graduating from high school with significantly higher commitment to activism than their peers in all the other schools that we were studying. And so again, we sort of asked ourselves, well, why would that be? And do we have interviews with students? Do we have field notes from observations? And I should say that we spent about 300 days as a team observing in these 5 schools over the course of 4 years. And so we had a lot of data that we could call on to try to answer the question, well, what's going on at Leadership High School that's leading students to graduate with higher commitment to activism? And one of the things we found.
You got muted, Scott.
I don't know how I did that, but sorry about that. If Make the Road Academy in the freshman year of high school sort of put a lot of emphasis on analysis through the social engagement class, Leadership High School sort of did the opposite. In the fall of senior year, they engaged their students in a class called Sociology of Change. Like, so the history class that young people took as seniors was this class called Sociology of Change, where they explicitly learned about sort of theories around activism. And so these are a couple of slides from the class, and that, so you can see how it says Gans's theory. That's actually a reference to Marshall Gans, who was the deputy sort of organizer for Cesar Chavez, like during the United Farm Workers campaigns, and then actually ran Barack Obama's grassroots campaign in the 2008 campaign. He's now a professor at Harvard. And Gans has written about sort of these are the components of an effective social action movement. And the students actually studied Gans's work on what makes for effective social action. And at the same time, they began sort of preparing for their own required change the world projects. And so like the class was half studying how social action works and half like a space to actually plan out the develop and execute their own social action projects that were a requirement for graduation. And here's just a picture of two of the social action projects that seniors in the class of 2000 in that class carried out. And so and I will say that these are two of the more substantive ones. It's one of the reasons I'm showing them. But I'll also show you in a few moments like some smaller examples of social action that folks engage in. And so on the left, on the picture on the left, you can see a group of seniors who decided that for their Change the World project, they were going to lead a die-in in front of their local police precinct to protest police violence against African Americans. And you can see that a number of students have taped black duct tape over their mouths to symbolize like the silencing of Black voices, like in the United States, in particular with regard to issues of police violence. And then on the right, you can see that the young lady who's sitting at the end, who looks like a high school student at the end of the table, what she actually planned for her Change the World project was a community conversation, a community dialogue around issues of gentrification in her community. And so she invited 3 guests. Gentrification was an issue that was strongly impacting the community in which her neighborhood and her school were located. She invited sort of 3 folks like who had sort of expertise in this, like one from the mayor's office in her city, one from a nonprofit, one from another, sort of an advocacy organization. She put flyers up around the neighborhood and held the event in the courtyard of a middle school in her community. And about 40 people turned out for this community dialogue around issues of gentrification and how to respond to it. And it was really impressive. It was a really impressive example of a young person. And you can see her actually moderating the conversation between the 3 speakers and the audience members. And so that was one example. And so that seems to have contributed, unquestionably to the higher commitment of activism of the young people at this school. But I think the one thing that was really interesting that we didn't anticipate initially was that yes, like participating in the social act in this Change the World project as a senior was impactful. But what was equally impactful, maybe even more impactful, was that the 9th, 10th, and 11th graders each year were watching the seniors engage in these projects, and oftentimes were actually being pulled into the projects, right? Because if every single senior needed to do a social action project, they needed like more person power, and that came in the form of 9th, 10th, and 11th graders. And so Angela was an 11th grader who participated in that police die-in in front of the police station, right? Like it wasn't her Change the World project. She'd been pulled into it by seniors who wanted additional person power. And Angela said some of the seniors had to make a Change the World project in order to graduate. And their project was like make some kind of change with like police violence. So we went on basically a march, I guess. We went to a precinct and then we just stood there with posters. Some of us laid on the ground, we stayed there for a while. And I think what was so interesting is then she said, it kind of made me feel like maybe what I'm doing may change something, Maybe people are going to start seeing what we did as, something important. And I think in that last sentence there, you can see the feelings of political agency growing in Angela, right? Like she had this opportunity to engage in social action with older peers. And now she's starting to think about like her power to contribute to political change. And I think even more amazing to us was that a 9th grader we interviewed also brought up the Change the World projects. And she said, I feel like the 12th graders are teaching us their ways so that we're able, when we get to 12th grade, to have a Change the World project that actually means something. And to me, that is so interesting, right? That like this senior year project was having this impact on the school culture that actually rippled all the way down to the 9th grade. And I think that opportunity for older students to be mentors to younger students was something that was incredibly powerful, like with regards to critical consciousness work. So that's an example at the high school level. Let me offer an example at the elementary school level. And this actually comes from the Mendel Elementary School, which is an elementary school in the city of Boston, who reached out to me sort of after one of these presentations and shared with me some ideas about doing this work at the elementary school level. And I should say that this happened during the pandemic. And so this was also somewhat like during like a phase of remote learning. And and this was with first graders. And so literally the opposite end of the schooling experience. And so the first graders in this particular class decided to do an audit of their classroom library to look at the diversity of the characters within their classroom library. And you can see, like, so they literally went through all of their books and checked off like the representation of the characters within the books that were available to them. And what you can see is that that their books had a very high, there were a number of books that had African-American characters, there were a number of books that had white characters, and there were a number of books that had animals as characters. But there were 0 books that had indigenous folks. There were very few books that had Latinx characters, and there were very few books that had Asian characters. And the students felt like that was a problem. Like this was an issue. And so they engaged in social action, right? Like, so they first of all, they did research to find books that they could, that would address some of these gaps in the diversity of their library. And then they created a donors choose page, like to fundraise the money that they felt like they would need in order to raise money to buy the books they hoped to buy. They succeeded, like they were fully funded for their goal. They purchased the books. They made thank you notes for the folks who contributed to their donors choose page. And then this is something that I think is so interesting and also and really gets at something very important about social action, right? Which is because of the pandemic, like, and by the time they sort of carried out this project, raised the money, ordered the books arrived, it was practically the end of the first grade year. And so like these first graders had raised money, had built up a more diverse classroom library that they themselves were not really going to benefit from because they were moving on to second grade. But what that meant was that the teacher actually had an opportunity to speak to the first graders about the idea of legacy, right? And about sort of creating sort of better opportunities for the kindergartners who are coming up behind them. And I think that's just such a powerful, that's such a powerful opportunity for the first graders to think about, like, this isn't just something that benefits us, but actually benefits like the younger folks in our community. And I think that, and to me, like this, the high school project and this project actually sort of resonate with each other because of that interaction between older students and younger students. And the last thing I want to say, here maybe is just that, I've given these 2 examples of social action that are pretty substantial, right? Like, I mean, the Change the World project at Leadership Academy and the Sociology of Change course really required like a whole school commitment to using the senior year in a particular way. That first grade example required a teacher to sort of like make a commitment to engaging in a multi-week project. But I also think that there are much smaller ways to engage in social action that are meaningful as well. And so another school in our study, Community Academy, in the 9th grade, the young people, as part of their humanities class, were studying Puerto Rico's relationship with the United States. Like, they were just literally investigating the question, is this relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States a just relationship? And the final assessment, the final assignment for the unit was just to write a letter to an elected representative, to one of the students' elected representatives, expressing their perspective on what the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States should be, and sort of advocating for a particular policy change. And of course, like, when you write to elected representatives, like if you write to a congressperson, if you write to a senator, if you write to a city councilor, like, you are going to get a response like from that office, right? Like someone in that office will sort of respond thoughtfully to what you've written. And and that information will sort of be cataloged and sort of be information for that elected representative about what's on the minds of constituents. And so one young person, Dana, just said, I feel like, in speaking about that assignment, she said, I feel like it gives us a voice because we're writing letters to the senators and representatives. And I feel like if we send out those letters, that it would make some type of improvement to what's happening. And so I think that even something like a single assignment that just sort of pushes students to engage with, with the quote unquote real world, like can be very meaningful to young people in terms of raising their feelings of political agency and commitment to social action. And so I would love to send you back to those same exact groups. Like, I think we're running out of time, and I need to make sure that well, actually, no, you know what? I think because we have till 12:35. Let me prioritize this. Like, and because I think it'll be, I think that will be the better use of our time. Let me send you back to those same groups and just give you the chance to ask the exact same 2 questions. Like, what ideas got sparked for you? What questions do you have? And we'll just take 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and finish up.
Girl being the main character.
So I both apologize for bringing you back, being able to give you so little time, but also I also feel sort of like that's the right decision to like give you space just to speak with each other. And so, I hope, since, as someone who has been a secondary teacher, been a faculty member, I really hope that this hour has felt like a useful use of your time, because your time is very valuable, especially in these sort of precious final days of summer. And so, so I really hope it felt useful to you in sort of catalyzing some of your own thinking. I'll just close with one thing, I clearly sort of didn't leave sufficient time for questions. And so I'll just put my contact information in the chat, and anyone should feel completely free to reach out to me. I'm going to putting my email address, I'm putting my Twitter handle, and please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to continue the conversation. And then maybe I'll just close before I turn it back to Kathy with just a couple instructions. I think, just to say this quote that I really like from Cami Talukian, who's an elementary educator, and she just wrote about doing this type of work. She just said, even though I still have room to grow, I also understand that I cannot wait for perfection to teach for equity and justice. This work is simply too urgent. And so, I would just say, it is tempting, I think, especially for those of us with humility, it's tempting to say, I don't know enough to jump in and try something. I need to learn more. And of course, I think that's an important stance. And I think humility is an important stance, but none of us will ever feel like we know all we need to know. Because these are dynamic issues, they're not static. And so my urge, sort of on behalf of the students you will, in your school, in your classroom, this year, who will never be second graders again, who will never be 11th graders again, is to try the thing that you've thought about trying, and don't expect perfection of yourself, but know that you're kind of creating opportunities for young people to engage in this, to engage in this sort of important thinking and action. And with that, maybe I'll just thank you so much for your time and turn it back to Kathy with just a couple of final pieces about where to go from here.
Awesome. Actually, I think I'm going to close you out. No worries. Thank you so much, Scott, for taking the time to share with us your expertise, your examples. I personally love the idea of contextualizing those practices that you shared to encourage students to analyze, activate their agency, and complete actions for change. I encourage you all to check out the book, Schooling for Critical Consciousness. I also love the strategy shared of systemic change. For example, the 3 I's of oppression framework, and how that was something all classrooms could utilize and embed in instruction. So thank you for so much. I have countless notes, amazing dialogue with those in the breakout space. I hope you all found that beneficial.